Thank you. You guys are troopers. You know, people like me get up, talk for 45 minutes or an hour and normally leave. But you know, I've been sitting back there with you all day, and I understand, right? It's hard when you sit on your rear all day, and then they feed you about 10 times as much as a man ought to eat for lunch. But you guys are hanging right in there, and we certainly appreciate it. So as a reminder, EPD are not new. You can go back 50 years, give or take, since these things were first made available to the beef industry. There on the left, Lytton Charlet from Missouri. To my knowledge, that's the first time an EPD was ever published, and it was in their sale catalog. They actually worked with Richard Willem, who was a faculty member at Iowa State at the time, to do that. Then on the right, National Sire Summary for the American Simmental Association, followed in 1971. Neat thing about that is that genetic evaluation was conducted at Boeing, so airline manufacturer Boeing, simply because that's the only place that existed that had the computers required to do the evaluation. Now, that same kind of evaluation that was done in 1971, you could easily do on your laptop, right? Fast forward to today, anyone heard of the company NVIDIA? Anyone play video games? You don't have to lie to me, right? Gaming industry. So the gaming industry has made use of graphic processing cards, right? Kind of hardware to enable these, lot of processes occurring simultaneously, like what would happen in playing video games, a lot of actions happening all at the same time. Regardless, that company NVIDIA makes those, that hardware to power the gaming industry, and that same kind of hardware is now used like by groups like the American Simmental Association to conduct their genetic evaluation, because now instead of calculating EPDs twice a year, they do it every 7 days on tens of millions of animals for up to 20 traits, right? So things have come a long way. Question is, do these tools work? Yeah, they work. That's beyond contestation, right? They work. Independent data from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, that's a USDA or a federal research facility located in Clay Center, Nebraska. They've got about 8,000 cows, down a little bit because of drought in eastern Nebraska. But on an annual basis, they actually calculate what's called a crossbreed EPD adjustment factors, and as a part of that process, they are able to answer the question, well, EPDs for principally growth and carcass traits, are they performing the way we expect them to? And we expect that if we make a 1 unit change in sire EPD, that'll manifest in a 1 unit difference in average offspring phenotype. And that's what they see. So that tells me that the tools work, and we've seen producers use these tools, being EPD, to make directional change in a lot of traits. But if a little's good, a lot's better. So we started out years ago with EPDs for birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, basically. And now, as I mentioned, we have EPDs for upwards of 20 different traits. Some of them are economically relevant, some aren't. So here's some examples here. And by economically relevant, I mean something that is directly tied to a source of revenue, a source of cost. That's something that's economically relevant. So first example, birth weight versus calving ease. Which one's economically relevant? This is calving ease. Calving ease is, I don't really care how big a calf is when it's born. I care about, did I have to supply assistance? Because that has a cost. I have to call a vet. Maybe it's bad enough I lose the calf and or the cow. If the cow makes it through it, she has decreased conception postpartum. So there's a real economic part of calving ease. Birth weight, however, is a valuable indicator of it. It just doesn't tell the whole story. And actually in the calving ease EPD calculation, birth weights are included in that. So if you use a calving ease EPD, you don't also use birth weight at the same time, or you're essentially double counting birth weight. Ribeye area versus yield grade, which is economically relevant. Yield grade, that's the thing that has premiums or discounts. They may not be sizable, but there's premiums or discounts associated with it. Yield grade is just part, or ribeye area is just part of the calculation. Yearling weight or carcass weight? Well, it kind of depends on when I sell my calves, doesn't it? Yep. If I sell them as yearlings, then to me, yearling weight is economically relevant. This is the strange thing about the beef industry, though. See, there, what is economically relevant to me is perhaps not what's economically relevant to the industry as a whole. That's the challenge with this segmented industry we have. But at an enterprise level, it depends on when you sell them. Last one is residual feed intake versus feed intake. Which one's economically relevant? Yeah, fair, honest question. Feed intake is just that, how much they ate on a daily basis, on a dry matter basis, right? That's feed intake. Residual feed intake is actually a calculated value. It's an index. Says, what's the difference in how much they ate versus what I expected them to eat given their level of performance, right? So up until 2021, I'd feed some cattle every year, so not in my own feedlot, right? I'd buy cattle, they go to a feed yard, I sent the feed yard money, right? And then they sent me checks when the cattle sold, and I just hoped that the checks I received back offset the cost of the cattle, right? That's cattle feeding in a nutshell. And they bill me for feed intake. They don't bill me for the residual. So it's feed intake, I'd argue, that's economically relevant. Yeah, so that's the interesting thing about residual feed intake. Let's say I'm a real slow gainer. Well, maybe I eat less than you would have predicted I ate, so my residual feed intake looks good. But I'm going to have to be on feed a long time before I get done. Well, that doesn't work, does it? So the ideal way, and we'll get to it, because somebody might arguably say, well, for feed intake, it matters how much they gain. And for gain, it matters how much they ate. What we do is we index those things together based on their relative economic importance. Right? So I can select for them simultaneously in an economic. Yeah, so a feedlot's always going to talk about feed conversion. The reason why we don't have EPDs for feed conversion ratio is just that, because it's a ratio. And ratios are unstable in a genetic evaluation, because I can make change in feed conversion by changing either the numerator or the denominator. And so you might hit kind of biological limits if you change one and not the other. Yeah. So we like to select on the independent components, gain and feed intake. There are indicator traits, though. So I talked about economically relevant traits. I'll talk about indicator traits, those that are genetically correlated to something that's economically relevant, but they themselves are not. Why might we need them? Well, they may be measured earlier in life, before the thing that's economically relevant can be expressed. So there's value in that. They may be cheaper or easier to measure. Think about carcass ultrasound. I can get a proxy for carcass merit on a live yearling seed stock animal. There's value in that. Something that can be measured on both sexes, right? Those are the places where indicator traits are of value. Now, your commercial clientele, right, commercial producers have more than one trait that impacts their net profitability, right? There's just not a single trait that impacts profitability. So they've got to select for multiple traits simultaneously. And there's basically three ways to do that. The first way is called tandem selection. So it says, maybe I'm going to select on calving ease until I get dystocia where I want it, which would be none, right? And once I get it there, I'm going to ignore calving ease and I'm going to start selecting on gain. The problem with that is, because those two things are genetically correlated, all of a sudden I start selecting on gain, I might erode the progress I made in calving ease. So that's the problem with tandem selection. The other is independent culling levels, and I've got an example of that. That's what most people do. They set these kind of admittedly ad hoc thresholds for a bunch of traits and say, for me to buy a bull, he's got to meet or exceed my threshold for all of these traits. And in my experience, what happens is people set those thresholds at home, They come to your sale, they look at the bulls, and they say, wait a second, that bull that I crossed off my list looks pretty good. Let me revise my thresholds, right? They cheat themselves. And then lastly is selection indices. So we'll dig into these last two in a bit more detail. This is an example of independent culling levels. I've got 4 bulls, and I have EPDs for calving ease direct, weaning weight, stayability, marbling, and then at the end I have an economic index. These are the thresholds I set up above. So if I adhere to those thresholds, keeping in mind calving ease, a higher value is more desirable, bull 4 I cross off my list, because he didn't meet my threshold for calving ease. But the reality is, he's a lot better than every other bull for weaning weight. He's a lot better for stayability, and he's a lot better for marbling. So if you look at the end there, the economic index values, he's actually got the higher index. He's the better bull in terms of a total package. Because an economic index allows for superiority of some traits to offset flaws in other traits, right? So if we think about what commercial producers should be selecting for, to sum it up, it's profit. You want to make more money. And money, right, profitable cattle can come in a lot of different packages. One of my favorite quotes is, find the cows that make you the most money and learn to like the way they look. Right? That's what we want to do. That's easier said than done. So why do we need selection indexes? This is a nice quote from Rick Borden, former faculty member at Colorado State. He said, there's no easily accessible, objective way for breeders, particularly breeders in the beef and sheep industries where ownership is diverse and production environments vary a great deal, to use these predictions intelligently. And by predictions, he meant EPDs. And I don't believe Dr. Borden was saying beef and sheep producers are so stupid they can't figure this out. What he was saying is, we made it too hard for you. We made very useful tools, then we made a bunch of them, and everyone's circumstances on their enterprise are slightly different. And we said, now go sort it out from here. A selection index allows you to take a lot of EPDs together and weight them towards what's most important economically. So foundationally, EPD allow directional change, but progress is conditioned on what your objectives are. It may behoove me to make my cattle bigger, but it may be in your best interest to make your cattle smaller. It depends on where we're starting from, right? How we market them, what our resources are. So enter economic selection indices. Those are designed to select for increased commercial level net profit. That's what they are designed to do. And the difference between index values of 2 bulls is our expected difference in net profit per exposure or per calf marketed, given the assumptions of the index. These tools aren't new. The first theory was published in the early 1940s. Actually, in plants, it was published in the late 1920s. Penetrated other livestock industries very quickly. So swine genetics, poultry genetics, exclusively traded based off of index value. Beef was a little bit late to the game. Didn't start offering these by breed associations until the early 2000s. And here's the reality of our business. As I mentioned before, genetics flows down. This is a breeding pyramid where you kind of have these elite seed stock breeders at the top. Although it's not completely clear, there do exist multipliers, right, that kind of multiply out those elite genetics. Then commercial cow-calf producers, and then I lump together packer, retailer, consumer. But genetics flows down that pyramid, and genetic signal, economic signal goes up. And there's substantial lag in both cases there. It takes a long time for elite genetics to flow down to the commercial industry, in part because we don't use artificial insemination a whole lot. And it takes a long time for economic signals to make it back up to inform breeding decisions by seed stock producers, because we are so segmented. My point here is, if you're going to be a seed stock producer that's actually helping your commercial clientele make more money, you need to have some understanding of what the profit drivers are for commercial cattle producers, some idea what the profit drivers are for feedlots. Otherwise, how do you know what to select on yourself if you don't know what's driving profit for the end user? So how to begin? Well, you've got to identify what the breeding and marketing goals are for your commercial customers, right? How and when do they sell calves? Do they keep their own replacement females back? Those kinds of simple, high-level questions. That helps identify what traits directly impact the profitability of the enterprise. And then along with that, identify any environmental constraints. And the reason I say environmental constraints is because environmental constraints inherently turn into economic constraints. So you may say, well, I don't have a lot of forage availability. Buy feed. And then you'd say, oh, that's too expensive. Well, now we identified an economic constraint, didn't we? Okay? Labor falls in my mind, to the environmental constraint bit. Right? If labor were unlimited and free, I wouldn't worry as much about dystocia. Have people pull them. But those two things aren't even remotely close to true, right? So all of a sudden now, part of my environment may be trying to reduce labor at calving. And I'd submit to you that bull buying should be akin to making an investment. Producers face the problem of obtaining the best bulls for their operation in a given setting, and best is a relative concept. What's best for me may not be best for you because our circumstances are different. And the reality is, a less desirable bull may become the preferred choice over a more desirable one if the sale discount is large enough. So in other words, people come to look through the bulls you have on offer. Hopefully they do their homework before they come, and they have a list of their top choices. Well, if the first bull on the list costs $5,000 more than the second bull on their list, but he doesn't have the genetic potential to return $5,000 more, I shouldn't buy him. I should buy the next bull, right? Because this is an investment I'm making in genetics, and they've got to return, right? They have to return. And so it can be hard, and that's why I always tell people we sell bulls at auction, because I don't want commercial bull buyers to stop and do the arithmetic, right? So we get some excitement going. But they've got to think, is the added money I'm going to spend to get that bull, does he have the genetic potential to return it? Same thing with buying semen. So selection index in a nutshell, I mentioned it's a tool to enable informed multiple trait selection based on breeding objectives. So how I market my calves, if I keep back my own replacements, helps determine the traits that go in that index. Economic parameters, so what's the costing of feed, what's the value of a pound of calf sold, those kinds of things. The relationships among traits, and then I put here the population or herd means, and I'll show you examples of that. But think about a trait like carcass weight. If you assume there is a discount threshold out there someplace, 1,100 pounds maybe, there's different economic incentive depending on where my average hot carcass weight is now. If it's 700 pounds versus 900 pounds, then adding an additional pound of carcass weight has a different value as I approach a discount threshold. So what impacts these things? Well, if I change what my breeding goal is, if instead of selling at weaning, I decide to retain ownership through the feed yard, that's a fairly substantial change. So all of a sudden now my breeding goal changed, and as a consequence, so should my index. Differences in economic parameters or assumptions. We'll talk more about this, but if I think about what the costing of a pound of feed is, generally I like to think about, well, what's it been over a long period of history, 5 to 10 years? Because what's really impactful in the weighting of traits in an index is the relationship between cost and return. And over a cattle cycle, those relationships tend to be fairly static. And then changes to population mean. So again, as I make improvement, perhaps some traits become less important to me and other traits become more important. So how do we come up with the economic values that end up being the weightings of traits in an index? A common way is to use something called stochastic simulation. So you can imagine behind the scenes, if you will, I simulate a very large population of cattle. And I can then go through and ask the question, well, what happens if I change the average hot carcass weight by 1 pound and hold every other trait constant? And then I can look at, well, how did that change profitability of the enterprise? And so I can begin to assign the marginal economic value associated with hot carcass weight. Here's an example of the fact that if we look on the left, those may be the goal traits, the things that are really economic drivers, but I don't have EPDs for all of them. On the right are the traits I have EPDs for. And there does not need to be a one-to-one relationship between the two, but they have to be genetically correlated. So you notice on the left, I want to improve yield grade, but I don't have a yield grade EPD. Maybe I just have the components like ribeye area, fat, and carcass weight. Something like, let's see, quality grade, right, I have marbling. Maybe I don't necessarily have anything related to yardage, but I have a days to finish EPD. So there doesn't have to be a one-to-one, again, relationship, but the traits that I have EPDs for have to be genetically correlated to the traits that are economically relevant. And I'd make the point that there's value going forward of being able to get data on traits that are profit drivers in our commercial industry. So there's a lot of economically relevant traits that aren't currently evaluated or collected routinely in the seed stock sector. However, every day in our industry they're collected, right? Reproductive phenotypes like longevity in commercial cow herds, disease, be it pulls, treatments, mortality, morbidity in feedlots, routine carcass data, the things that maybe drive plant value like primal yield, incidence of dark cutters, blood splash, etc. So somebody asked the question earlier, what are the big, I suppose, steps going forward with genetic prediction and genetic evaluation? We talked about what that is for genomics. The other thing is reaching further down in the commercial industry, getting the data that are really profit drivers and bringing that back up to genetic evaluations to use to calculate EPDs for. Right? That's the next, I think, big hurdle that we have. So terminal versus maternal, I'm going to start talking through some index examples. Somebody mentioned this in swine. This does happen. I have nucleus herds dedicated to making terminal boars, nucleus herds dedicated to making dam lines, and then at the commercial industry, we cross. Right, so unless you're buying kind of this farmer niche market pork, the pork you buy in the grocery store is at least a three-way cross, if not more advanced than that. That's just what it is. Beef cattle is different, but there's certainly logic in that delineation. Unfortunately, the beef industry is not currently structured to really take advantage of specialized lines for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the fact that most commercial producers retain their own replacements for a variety of reasons. A couple of reasons is nobody has better cows than I have, right? My cows are the best, okay? The other is, well, you know, it's my hay, so it's kind of like free hay, so I can feed them that and develop them. Well, it's obviously not free. You could sell it. Obviously, commercial producers might take the decision to be terminal only, buy replacements, and every calf born then is destined to be sold either at weaning or through the feed yard. A benefit of that, as I'll talk through, is then when those producers are out buying bulls, it's a smaller list of traits which they have to focus on, only terminal traits. And there are some advantages in that. But given the majority of people sell calves and retain their own replacement females, it's a longer list of traits which they have to focus on. And because it's a longer list of traits to focus on, the progress they make in any one of them will be less, because you're spreading emphasis over more traits. So this isn't, if you don't see your favorite breed up here, it's not with malice aforethought, okay? So don't get mad at me. But I've delineated a lot of indexes available in the U.S. beef industry as either being terminal or general purpose. General purpose means I'm keeping back replacement females and selling terminal calves. The point I want to make here is we have a lot of indexes, and if you take what is probably the most popular index, at least was, probably still is in the beef industry, that's Angus's dollar beef index, that dollar B, very useful tool if you are truly all terminal, meaning every calf that hits the ground, okay, male or female, is destined to go to the feed yard, be fed out, you retain ownership, and sell on a CAB grid. If that fits you, that's a very useful tool. But if you keep back your own replacements, you should use something like Angus's dollar M or dollar C, which has those assumptions. Because otherwise, dollar B is going to put emphasis on hot carcass weight, marbling, ribeye, dry matter intake. Nothing about mature cow size. In fact, it'll increase mature cow size, right? Nothing about heifer pregnancy. So these are extremely useful tools, but like any tool, you got to use the right tool for the right job, okay? So this is how you might think about using them. This is from Simmenthal's All-Purpose Index, API. I have two bulls, bull A and bull B. Those are their indexes for API. So the difference between them is 24. My arithmetic right? Yeah, 24. Let's assume I'm going to expose a bull to 30 cows a year. I'm going to keep bulls for 4 years. That's 120 exposures over that bull's lifetime. I can multiply that number of exposures by the difference in their index values and come up with an estimate of how much more profit bull A would generate for me than bull B. That assumes I follow the assumptions of that index, meaning I do keep back my own replacements. All culls are retained through the feed yard and sold on a value-based grid. Now, back to my earlier comment, what if bull A costs $5,000 more than bull B? Probably not the better buy then, is it? Unless, how do I change that $2,800, $2,900 if I can get more exposures? So what if anyone in here work for a semen distributor? Okay, good. So what if I custom collected this bull and I AI'd using him and then I turned him out natural service? I just increased the number of exposures, didn't I? Which then I can increase the value that he holds for me, right? But think about it that way, or encourage your customers to think about it that way. All right, question is how sensitive are these tools, economic index values? So I'm going to go through just a couple of examples to test sensitivity to the marginal economic values we assign to traits or the genetic relationship between one trait and others. And the point is I'm going to show you some efficiency values. 1 means there's absolutely no difference. Less than 1 says that one set of values I assumed are different, and perhaps there's some sensitivity. So we went through and looked at a terminal index, and unless I started toying with hot carcass weight, which is really the driver of the index, it was pretty insensitive to changes in the genetic relationships among traits. Same thing with changes to the economic values. And the only time these indexes became sensitive is if I did things that weren't even reasonable, right? I changed the economic value of hot carcass weight by 50%. Well, holy smokes, nobody's going to be off that far, right? So the point is, and also they were fairly robust as to whether I marketed calves as calf feds versus yearlings. So these indexes that I showed you a couple of slides ago offered by beef breed associations are pretty robust across a lot of different circumstances that you and your commercial clientele would experience. That said, unique circumstances do exist, and this is a tool that I and colleagues developed through a USDA grant. We call it iGenDec. It's a web-based decision support tool now offered through the Beef Improvement Federation. And what this tool allows the user to do is to use their own herd performance to inform this economic index construction. So what's the current performance of your cow herd in terms of the cow age distribution, in terms of death loss due to dystocia, preg rate, average weight at the point of sale, what's it cost you to feed a cow a year? Those kinds of things. What breed of cows you use, what breed of bulls do you use, and then behind the scenes it does the stochastic simulation and the economic index construction and spits out the index weights that are applicable to your enterprise. I use this to illustrate a couple of finer points that I want to talk through, and that is if I changed hog carcass weight from having an average of 850 pounds to 920 to 950, when there is a discount threshold at 1050, how does that change how important that trait is to me? Or if we think about calving ease direct, if I lose 0% of my calves due to dystocia now, and all of a sudden I start losing 2%, how does that change how important that trait is to me? So what these pie charts are relative emphasis. So relatively speaking, how important are these traits to my particular breeding objective or breeding goals? I know this is hard to see, but if we go from the top left to the top right to the bottom, as I increased my average hog carcass weight and it got closer and closer to that discount threshold, the relative emphasis I should put on hog carcass weight in my breeding program went from 41% all the way down to 32%. So as I changed my population, I changed how much emphasis I should put on that trait. Similarly, with calving ease direct, if I go from 0% death loss due to dystocia on the top right to 2%, or top left, to 2% on the bottom right, if I'm not losing any calves due to dystocia, calving ease really isn't important for me to select on. I don't have a problem. I start losing 2% of my calves, that's big. Now all of a sudden about 10% of my emphasis needs to be on decrease or improving calving ease. Now a lot of people would say, if I don't have a problem with calving ease now, I never want to have a problem. So I don't care economically what I should do, I'm still going to select on calving ease. That probably fits most of your bull buyers. That then is not an economically optimized decision. That's a decision based on risk aversion, right? They've said, probably not consciously, but they've said it's not about economics at this point. It's about risk, and I just can't risk it. That's an okay decision. I would prefer they recognize that trade-off, though. Back to my investment example, right? If it's sitting in the bank, it's not making me any money, but nobody's taking it away, versus putting it in the stock market. Yeah, Dare?
All right, struggling with this one a little bit. So the 0%, that's based on, doesn't that have to be based on some level of calving ease direct that has been used up to that point? Without having that reference, how does it work?
Yeah, so not really. So it just says that there is zero, at the phenotypic level, zero death loss due to dystocia, which would suggest there is some kind of underlying genetic potential for calving ease already there. But it could be, right, that the environment is such that even if the genetics for calving ease are bad, it never expresses. But regardless, they're not experiencing any kind of economic loss due to dystocia. So there's no economic benefit in changing it.
So suppose I had been using those plus 20 calving ease bulls before, and now it's telling me I don't have to worry about it at all, so now I could use a 0 calving ease bull. It would get me in a lot of trouble, right?
Yeah, could over time. Certainly could over time. Yeah. So two bits to that. One is, ideally, over time, what a producer would do is update their phenotypic performance, right? So as you're making change and moving along, you update your herd performance, which then updates this thing. Where should I be putting emphasis? To your point, though, you don't want this yo-yo effect, right? No problem today, 5 years from now, big problem. But that goes to the risk aversion bit. It not only goes to the risk aversion bit, but also, I'll talk about here in a little bit, is what's my planning horizon? So this notion of, if I buy a bull today, how far out into the future do I want to look to determine the economic impact of that sire selection decision? If I'm completely terminal, I've got a short-term outlook on the future because all the calves are going to be marketed and go away. As soon as I start keeping back replacement females, my planning horizon economically may be a lot longer, right? And so there are optimums, aren't there? More isn't always better. And part of what happens too, and you see this particularly in smaller herds, I buy a calving ease bull to turn out on heifers. Well, in a few years that bull gets big, and I don't want to expose him to heifers anymore. So I take that bull that was designed to breed heifers because he's calving ease, and now I put him on mature cows. Well, those mature cows ought to be able to lay down and have a big calf. So what I've done is sacrifice growth in doing that. This is the idea of planning horizon. So pH is planning horizon. I looked at planning horizons of 2, 5, 10, 20, 30, and 50 years. 50 years, probably not reasonable. We'll be raising cows on the moon or wherever we'll be by then. But what I wanted to show was that if I have a short-term planning horizon like 2 years, that is a different index than if I have a planning horizon of 20 or 30 years. So the darker red says there's a really strong correlation between the indexes. You get this kind of orange or yellow, there's a weaker correlation. So if you look kind of in the top left there, that's the correlation between a 50-year planning horizon and a 2-year planning horizon. It's not the same index. So if I have a really short-term planning horizon, the traits that I'm going to emphasize in my selection are the traits that are manifest earlier in life. Sale weight, namely, be it weaning weight or carcass weight. If I have a planning horizon that goes out 20 or 30 years, now all of a sudden, and I keep back replacement females, I'm going to emphasize things like stayability or sustained cow fertility, mature cow weight, the things that take longer to express. So if I'm a commercial cow-calf producer that retains replacement females, it probably behooves me to have a longer-term planning horizon, which means that I'm going to put more emphasis on those kinds of things expressed later in life. Now this is very situational too, because any ag lenders in the room? Yeah, okay, yeah. Well, the thing about ag lenders is when you take money from them, they want it back. And so, right, if I have an operating note, yeah, maybe I want to be in the business for the long run, but I need some revenue now, right, to pay down things. And so I may need to emphasize traits like sale weight a little bit more than I'd prefer because I have a real need for revenue up front. So it becomes unique and situational depending on where people sit. And also, what are your transition plans for the ranch or for the enterprise? Here what I did was interlaid sale endpoint. So the W means I sell calves at weaning. The C says I sell calves in the beef. I interlaid the sale endpoint with planning horizon. Again, 2 years out to 50 years. 2 take-homes from this. Okay? If I sell calves at weaning, that is entirely a different index than if I sell calves in the beef. Entirely different. Because for selling them at weaning weight is my source of revenue. If I sell calves in the beef, weaning weight's actually a source of cost, right? The other thing is there's certainly, again, as I showed before, a difference in whether I have a short-term outlook on the economic impact of sire selection decisions or a long-term impact. So key messages, the choice of endpoint matters. So situation is more complex if you're generating demand through sale of high quality feeder calves and post-weaning value is shared. In other words, if I sell at weaning, but whoever I sell them to, the feed yard or the backgrounder, is somehow rewarding me for the quality of my calves, right? Then all of a sudden lines get blurred a little bit. But that's not as popular in our industry as perhaps what I might like. Length of planning horizon does matter, and it's related to selection for short-term versus longer-term profit. And you've got to think about that, right? Am I trying to maximize profitability in the short term versus the long term? And those two things can be at odds with each other. So incorrect emphasis could create long-term profitability concerns. So if I am keeping back my own replacement females, but I'm not putting appropriate emphasis on mature cow weight or sustained fertility, I could be shooting myself in the foot long term. But if you're completely terminal, then that all becomes a moot point, and admittedly selection is a little bit easier for you at that point. So what we've done as animal breeders over history is taken data, right? Phenotypic records, now genomic data, moving to whole genome sequence data, taking that data, turning it into knowledge, which is the EPDs. And I think what we're finally starting to stop and consider is the fact that we need to take these tools and help turn them into actionable decisions. Because there's not really a return on investment and data if it never enables a decision. So that's what we've tried to do with economic selection indexes and more recently the web-based tool that I described like iGenDec. Right, so think about it this way. Right, these things, which so many of us rely on, if I'd just given you a set of directions on how to build it yourself, how many of you would have one? Right? No one. No one. Instead, they put it in a form which is unbelievably intuitive to use, in all seriousness. Children, it's amazing how they can just pick it up and they know how to use it. We need to have that same thought process with our genetic selection tools. Indexes are one step in that direction. So I say here, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but it should only take one, right? So for commercial bull buyers, I think life can be a lot simpler if you at least initially focus on the economic selection indexes, because it does a pretty good job at pointing you in the right direction, at least. Right? So I say here, new tools alone don't enable selection for profitability or for sustainability. It's in the way that you use it. It's a quote from Slowhand, right? So these tools like indexes, very useful, but you got to use it appropriately. And then, of course, another plug for that, and the same web resources I showed you before. So with that, be happy.